From Software's impact on mainstream gaming over the past decade is undeniable. During an age where countless games tried to make things easier for players in the name of accessibility, their Dark Souls-style games' challenging but fair philosophy brought back a more conscious appeal to difficulty. It showed how providing legitimate obstacles makes all the difference in how we experience video games, and would eventually spawn a whole new genre of soulslikes. Dark Souls had this slow and methodical pace to it that, despite talk of how hard the game was clear in telling the player that it was going to be a surmountable experience. Of course, this was true as long as the player was willing to persevere and be careful in how they engaged with their enemies. It was a type of caution that was often encouraged in their titles before Bloodborne. The early stages of Demon Souls and Dark Souls would offer players shields, and much of the game design and direction tends to favor a more defensive approach to boss fights as you wait for a clear opening. Of course, there are ways to play Dark Souls actively and aggressively, but there were obvious signs that in several moments where you were really meant to take it slow. It made us look back to how some of our fondest memories of playing action games was with skillfully engaging in a dance with the enemy because there was lots of stuff going on in the game that encouraged us to keep going. This is where Sekiro Shadows Die Twice comes in. A game that arguably offers From Software's most cinematic combat system. Sure, you can say Elden Ring is more badass with the right setup, but Sekiro just looks and feels inherently cinematic in its moment-to-moment gameplay. Okay, look, if we're still regularly watching clips of its boss encounters long after we uninstall the game, that says a lot about how good it looks. But beyond its presentation, what makes Sekiro a contemporary masterpiece compared to other From Software titles is the implementation of its combat system. It is a game, as a lot of veterans would know, where hesitation is defeat. So we're here today to talk about why we need more games like Sekiro and just how effective its frantic combat mechanics are. Of course, we gotta ask, what kind of game is Sekiro anyway? To be honest, it's just Dark Souls with extra steps. Before you react and say, Sekiro is different because yada 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 yada, we don't mean that in a bad way. Hell no! We're aware that it does do away with a lot of the conventions of Dark Souls. I mean, this video is focused on the stuff that sets it apart from those games. But it is still based on the Dark Souls formula at heart. Many elements will be instantly familiar to those who have played any other From Software titles. Beyond interacting with Sculptor's idols the same way you would with a Dark Souls bonfire, aspects of the level design, pacing, atmosphere, and conveyance of lore have this unmistakable familiarity to them. Not to mention how the game still adheres to the rewarding difficulty that made From Software famous. Alongside its roots in From Software design philosophies, Sekiro Shadows Die Twice is a game that is defined by the frantic nature of its combat encounters. It is much more frantic than anything that From Software has done before because of the mechanics and systems that compel the player to act. Much of Sekiro's combat is centered around its posture system. Instead of attacking an enemy's health bar directly, referred to as vitality in the game, the goal in most fights is to fill an enemy's posture meter. This posture meter represents an enemy's balance and, well, posture. When it's successfully filled, it'll open up to a death blow, which will deplete an entire bar of vitality and outright kill most enemies. However, breaking an enemy's posture is easier said than done. The meter recovers over time if there isn't constant attacking and no pressure is placed upon the enemy. That being said, one's posture recovery rate is also dependent on the amount of vitality the enemy has left. It may seem similar to certain stagger mechanics found in other games, but we'll get to that later. Take note that the rules of the posture meter will also apply to Sekiro himself, which is where the player's defensive options come into play. The player can prevent incoming attacks by blocking, but this will come at the cost of filling up their own posture meter. It is a deflex that will be the player's main form of defense. Assigning your block right before an enemy lands their attack will inflict posture damage and eventually stagger them, giving players a chance to counterattack. It's not as difficult as the parries in Dark Souls. In fact, it can be forgiving. The timing isn't as strict and players can deflect a series of attacks before the enemy staggers. If your timing is off, chances are you'd end up just blocking the enemy attack at the cost of posture. You can still get hit if you don't block on time, but this system does allow for a margin of error. Players also have to deal with perilous attacks that require enemies to either jump or counter by dashing towards the enemy. These are compelling mechanics because it forces players to pay close attention to every attack, every swipe, and every lunge. We're not saying that other games didn't force you to be mindful of what your enemies do, but Sekiro's active form of defensive mechanics makes it very distinct from most action games. Sekiro is also capable of doing a step dodge, but it's not as reliable as the dodge mechanics found in Bloodborne and Dark Souls. It actively discourages dodging as the main defensive tactic because enemies are designed to be engaged with head-on. So, less dodge rolls. That's quite the departure if you're used to Dark Souls. Deflecting, posture mechanics, and challenging enemies all weave together to create an incredibly engaging combat system that opposes the passive playstyle that a lot of Dark Souls players fall into. It's a system that creates momentum when it demands players to partake in a dance of deflects and retaliation, resulting in a frantic experience when working in the context of FromSoftware's iconic difficulty. Dark Souls is its own game. There are valid merits as to why it was created that way, paced that way. Dodging away in anxiety and holding up your shield as you hesitate to move closer is part of that experience. But as we know in Sekiro, hesitation is defeat. You can't effectively win by simply waiting for a chance to launch a failed strike. You can't win by stepping away. The ever-fleeting posture meter forces you to fight for every inch of that opening. Sure, you can win a lot of fights defensively, but doing so still requires you to be within reach of the enemy, having to put yourself in harm's way as you struggle to deflect and counter every attack. Sekiro is also incredibly cinematic in motion. As we mentioned earlier, we can't emphasize enough just how rewatchable the combat is. There's just something about actually seeing swords clash as a result of the enemy defending themselves, rather than just slicing a person's skin each time you attack. There's also another angle as to why we would love to see Sekiro's formula be seen in more games. The presence of the posture system and its nuanced mechanisms add a lot to the immersion because it simply is believable to be fixated on your enemy's composure versus your own. The fact that posture recovery rate is tied to the remaining vitality makes it immersive to see a boss struggle to recover their posture as you slowly chip away at their health. Standoffs aren't scripted either, and it isn't just us trying to look cool. Okay, well, sometimes it is.
That was sick.
But what we're trying to say here is that there is a mechanical precedent for this. The player, and to some extent the boss as well, can recover their posture faster when holding a blocking stance. It's a brief and cinematic respite before the action ramps up again. A lot of games have deep combat mechanics, but it's not that common to see a game offer such a cinematic feel while also offering this much mechanical depth. It's a beautiful display of swift swordplay that is masterfully reinforced by not just its stellar animation, but also because of its gameplay systems. It really makes you feel like you're in a sword fight, especially when you compare it to something like Ghost of Tsushima. For all its innovations and excellent game design, a lot of it just stems from implementing mechanics that demand initiative from the player. We're always motivated by the simple need to defeat our adversaries and take the spoils that come with it. And this philosophy is integral to giving players a frantic experience. Things like Devil May Cry Style Gauge similarly encourage people to keep up their combo variety to maintain a steadily depleting meter. It motivates you to make use of the wide assortment of moves at your disposal. Games with style-based systems differ from Sekiro because it's mostly reliant on intrinsic motivations when encouraging players to actively engage with the enemy. Combo systems can also work differently from what DMC does. For example, Arkham Knight and Shadow of Mordor's free-flow combat offers a variety of special abilities after reaching a certain combo count, effectively encouraging players to maintain a flawless offensive. It's a vastly different system from what Sekiro offers, but still encourages the player to be very proactive. But unlike Sekiro, players can get by without fully engaging with these mechanics. So unless you're playing for the high score challenges or simply have the intrinsic motivation to look cool, you can win by prioritizing your safety versus your combo count. The same thing can be said for DMC's style meters, since most players don't need to combo as much to get through their first playthrough. Time limits are a tried and tested way of giving a sense of urgency. It's a classic mechanic that goes back to the days of retro arcade games. Of course, it was bad for business to let a single player hog an entire cabinet. Time limits could be seen in just about any arcade game. Rail shooters, side-scrollers, racing games, etc. The application of time limits in fighting games was something that went beyond the machines, as seeing it in home consoles really shows how integral it is to the genre. We'll admit that some of us did disable time limits back then when we were kids playing Tekken at our friend's house, but fighting game fans would know how important it is to each round's pacing. It's also prevalent in mobile games, which is in line with its on-the-go game design. If you've played games like Punishing Gray Raven or Genshin Impact's Spiral Abyss, you'd easily see how these time limits encourage players to skillfully navigate within these bite-sized experiences. Sekiro doesn't explicitly do time limits, but the posture system is a time-sensitive mechanic that is quite believable. You can't give your opponent too much time to rest, so certain duels do end up pacing themselves like some fighting games would. Perhaps some of the more similar systems to Sekiro's posture system are those that feature some sort of stagger meter. Recent, more action-oriented Square Enix titles like Final Fantasy VII Remake and Final Fantasy XVI encourage players to keep the pressure up through party coordination or high combo counts respectively, bringing the enemy into a vulnerable, staggered state. Even games from the Tales series have a lot of frantic gameplay elements that are similar to this. But these systems aren't just limited to real-time action games. Other types of JRPGs can be extremely frantic as well. Square Enix's stagger system actually finds its roots in Final Fantasy XIII's active turn-based system. Players had to make sure the enemy's stagger meter was getting filled, meaning that they had to ensure that they weren't spending too much time healing or buffing up the party. Residents of Fate also had an extremely frantic turn-based system where players would be punished for being unable to defeat enemies before their resources ran out. There are two games often compared to Sekiro, Neo and Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order, and naturally their respective sequels. They're definitely close, but not quite. There are a lot of comparative misconceptions on how these games play when put alongside Sekiro. Sure, they're both Dark Souls inspired titles that excel on one-on-one duels, and there are moments in these games that are quite reminiscent of what it's like to fight within Sekiro's posture system. But at the end of the day, both games were developed with Dark Souls, not Sekiro, in mind. Neo's key system is a deep and innovative take on Dark Souls' stamina management, but it's fundamentally different from the posture system, even if it also does feature cool death blows. Fallen Order, on the other hand, features a stamina system that dictates how much your Jedi can block. Parrying, just like Sekiro's deflex, also damages the enemy's stamina, opening up many enemies to a death blow when depleted. Combat in Fallen Order can be approached as if you were playing Sekiro, and I would say this is one of the most rewarding ways to play the game. Unlike Sekiro, however, both games can still be played in a hesitant manner. You'll always have the freedom to dodge away in both games and approach it like you're fighting a Dark Souls boss. The focus is still on whittling down their HP as opposed to whittling down your opponent's composure. They're both amazing games that, like so many games in the past 10 years, have innovated upon the Souls formula. But that brings me to another point. We need more games like Sekiro. We've already seen so many interpretations of Dark Souls' legacy, and we think it's about time for more game developers to follow in the footsteps of Sekiro's deflect and posture-based gameplay. We've already talked about how potentially engaging and cinematic its combat is, and the idea of seeing this type of gameplay be improved and innovated on is very exciting. As of this video, we currently have an honestly frustrating shortage of Sekiro-inspired titles. I mean, I had to resort to a rabbit waifu indie game just to scratch that Sekiro itch. By the way, this game is called Kanagi Usagi and you guys should try it. But the few titles that we do have definitely magnify the potential of Sekiro's legacy. Wulong Fallen Dynasty is what you get if Nioh and Sekiro had a love child. This is literally what Nioh would look like if it went ham on Sekiro's philosophy rather than Dark Souls. It also offered a lot of Nioh's innovative features such as in-depth RPG elements, spells, special attacks, and a wide variety of weapons to choose from. It adds more into the risk versus reward factor of Sekiro by having much of your spells and special attacks come at the cost of your posture. Sifu shows how much Sekiro's combat philosophy can be innovated upon in different settings. It's more of a beat-em-up kung fu game with a lot of unique gameplay elements that also has a bit of roguelike philosophy into it. The game's implementation of Sekiro's posture meter when facing against a gang of grunts really makes you feel like a kung fu master, unlike Sleeping Dog's superficial way of making you feel like you were in an action flick. Last but not least is FromSoftware's Armored Core 6. For a game that focuses a lot on firearms and missiles, it sure as hell has a lot of Sekiro DNA. Limited ammunition and the need to fill the enemy mech's stagger gauge forces players to step into the fray. But most of all, it shows how Sekiro's game design philosophy can be translated into other genres.
確かにもらい受けた
Maybe the reason we don't have a lot of Sekiro-likes is that they're currently being developed, or at the very least being formulated by inspired developers who had the privilege of experiencing Sekiro's adrenaline-inducing gameplay. Hell, the idea of a spiritual sequel from FromSoftware themselves is something to be hyped about. The future is bright for these types of games, and we can't wait to see what they'll think of next. What about you guys? Know any other cool Sekiro-likes out there to scratch that itch? What other innovative gameplay systems do you think other games should take inspiration from? Let us know in the comments. Thanks again for watching our videos, and we'll see you in the next one.